They thought they were hunting two black men in the Mississippi woods. Just another warning, another night of fire and fear. But Elijah and Elias Carter weren't farmers. They were soldiers, Union veterans who'd fought through Shiloh, buried brothers, and learned exactly how to make the earth burn back. The clan came riding with hoods, crosses, and pride, ready to teach a lesson. What they found were ghosts from the war they thought they'd won. One twin fought with mercy, the other with memory. And when the night screamed, even the swamp itself seemed to remember the Union drums. By sunrise, the hunters were gone, and a legend was born. Because some men fight to live, and others live to finish the fight. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The road stretched before them like an unwinding bandage, revealing old wounds beneath. Dust kicked up from their mules' hooves as the wagon creaked along the familiar path. Elijah Carter sat tall at the reins, his face weathered and hard, a long scar cutting across his right cheek. Beside him, his twin brother Elias looked out at the fields with quiet sorrow. "Everything's different," Elias said softly, yet somehow exactly the same. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across land that once belonged to black families. Now Confederate flags hung from porches that weren't theirs to claim. Fields their neighbors had worked now filled the pockets of men who'd fought to keep them in chains. "Vultures," Elijah muttered, his voice low and steady, feeding on what wasn't theirs to take. The wagon rattled over a worn bridge. In the back, tools shifted against lumber they'd purchased with hard-saved Union pay. Hidden beneath a worn tarp lay a folded blue flag, the colors they'd bled for while the South burned. "You think anyone will remember us?" Elias asked. Elijah's grip tightened on the reins. "Better if they don't." The brothers fell silent as they passed the Wilkins property. Thomas Wilkins, once the largest slave owner in the county, now sat on the town council. His cotton fields stretched green and lush, worked by sharecroppers trapped in new chains made of debt and threats. "His son died at Antietam," Elijah said flatly. "I remember." Elias nodded. "You pulled me down when the cannons opened on his regiment." "Some days, I still hear them," Elijah said. The cannons. The road curved around a stand of cypress trees, their branches draped with Spanish moss that swayed like hanged men in the breeze. Beyond the trees lay the remains of what once was home. The wagon stopped. Neither brother spoke as they stared at the charred foundation stones of their father's cabin. Blackened timbers jutted from the ground like broken bones. Weeds had reclaimed most of the yard, but a cleared path led to a simple wooden cross driven into the earth behind where the cabin once stood. Elijah climbed down first, his movements precise and controlled. 6 years as a Union sapper had taught him to watch every step. Elias followed, adjusting the worn spectacles that gave his face a scholarly look, despite the strength in his frame. They approached the grave together. Someone had carved words into the cross. "Know your place." Elias reached out, his fingers tracing the hateful letters. "They murdered him for teaching children to read." "They murdered him for believing things could change," Elijah corrected, his voice flat, but his eyes burning. From the wagon, Elijah retrieved a rolled piece of paper, building plans drawn with a soldier's precision. They spread them on a flat stone, weighted by a handful of nails. "Father's cabin, but bigger," Elias said. "Room enough for a classroom in the back." "We'll need to clear the foundation first," Elijah said, already calculating. 2 days to level the ground. Another week for the frame if we work from sunup to sundown." "The children need this," Elias said. "Most haven't held a book since the bureau schools closed." Elijah nodded, but his eyes scanned the tree line, looking for movement. "We'll build it, but quietly." They unloaded enough supplies to make a simple camp. As Elias arranged stones for a fire pit, Elijah walked the perimeter, studying angles and lines of sight, like he'd done countless times in Virginia and Tennessee. "You're still at war," Elias observed as his brother returned. "War taught me to stay alive." Elijah sat on a stump, cleaning dirt from his hands with methodical precision. "And I remember how you fought," Elias said. "Like you had nothing to lose." "I had you to protect," Elijah answered simply. "Still do." The brothers sat in comfortable silence as Elias coaxed flames from kindling. The fire caught, casting dancing light across their identical faces, mirror images separated only by Elijah's scar and harder eyes. "You were always better with books," Elijah said finally. "Father saw that in you, the gentleness, the patience. And you were always the soldier," Elias replied, "even before you wore the uniform. We balance each other." As darkness settled around them, Elias laid out their simple dinner, cornbread and salt pork. The familiar ritual of sharing food brought back memories of army camps and long marches. "Remember what Colonel Davis told us at Shiloh?" Elias asked. A rare smile touched Elijah's lips. That we were the first twins he'd met, who could read each other's minds across a battlefield. He wasn't far wrong. The sound came faintly at first, hoofbeats in the distance, steady and purposeful. Both men tensed, heads turning toward the sound in perfect unison. Through the trees came flickering lights, torches moving in a scattered line. Without a word, Elijah kicked dirt over their small fire. Elias gathered their few possessions, movements quick but controlled. They crouched behind their wagon as the riders passed on the main road, white hoods visible in the torchlight. Laughter drifted through the trees, confident, unchallenged laughter of men who feared no consequences. The brothers remained still until the last torch disappeared around the bend. Slowly, Elijah rekindled their small fire. "They ride openly now," Elias said quietly. "Because no one stops them," Elijah replied. He stared into the flames, the firelight dancing along his scar. War doesn't end just because they change the flags. The night wind picked up, carrying faint laughter from the direction of town, the sound of men who believed they still owned this land and everyone on it. Morning light filtered through the trees as Elijah and Elias worked methodically on the foundation of their father's cabin. Elijah leveled stones with precision, while Elias mixed mortar in a wooden bucket. Their shirts stuck to their backs in the humid heat, but neither complained. They'd endured worse during the war. "Pass me that large stone," Elijah said, pointing to a flat rock near his brother's feet. Elias handed it over. "This one should fit that corner just right." As they worked, small faces appeared between the trees. 5 children, thin but bright-eyed, watched from a cautious distance. The youngest couldn't have been more than 6. The oldest, maybe 12. "We've got company," Elias said softly. Elijah glanced up, his face softening slightly at the sight of the children. "Folks from the freedmen's camp must have spread word we're back." Elias straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Hello there," he called gently. "Would you like to help us build?" The children hesitated, looking at each other until the oldest girl nodded. They approached slowly, eyes wide with curiosity. "I'm Mr. Elias," he said with a warm smile. "And this is my brother, Mr. Elijah." "You twins?" a small boy asked, his eyes darting between them. "Sure are," Elias replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of nails. "You know how to count?" The children shook their heads. "Well then," Elias said, kneeling down. He arranged the nails in a row on a flat piece of wood. "Let's learn together." While Elijah continued working on the foundation, Elias gathered pebbles and more nails, teaching the children to count by 1s and 2s. Their voices rose in chorus. 1, 2, 3. "Now," Elias continued, "if I have 4 nails and add 2 more, how many do I have?" The children's faces scrunched in concentration. The oldest girl timidly raised her hand. 6? "That's exactly right," Elias beamed. You're a natural mathematician. The sound of hooves interrupted their lesson. A horse approached from the main road, its rider sitting tall in a dusty black coat. A silver star pinned to his chest caught the sunlight. "Children," Elias said quietly, "why don't you run along home now? We'll continue our lesson tomorrow." The children scattered like leaves in the wind, disappearing into the trees as Sheriff Harlan Bixby dismounted. He was a wiry man with a neat mustache and cold eyes that never seemed to match his smile. "Well, well," Bixby drawled, thumbs hooked in his belt. "If it ain't the Carter boys, all grown up and back home." Elijah straightened, wiping his hands slowly on his trousers. "Sheriff, heard you two joined up with Lincoln's army," Bixby said, his gaze sweeping over their work. "Fought against your own neighbors." "We fought for freedom," Elias replied evenly. "Same as our father believed in." Bixby's smile tightened. "Your father had ideas that didn't suit the times." "Times have changed," Elijah said, his voice flat. "Not as much as you might think." Bixby kicked at a loose stone with his boot. "Town councils still run by the same families. Same men own the cotton fields and the timber mills." He looked up, his false smile returning. "Just wanted to pay my respects and give you boys some friendly advice. Men round here don't take kindly to Union colors. We're just here to rebuild our father's home," Elias said. "And teach children," Bixby noted, glancing at the counting stones. "Like your daddy did." A heavy silence fell between them. "Well," Bixby finally said, mounting his horse, "consider yourselves warned. Some folks got long memories about the war." He tipped his hat. "Good day, gentlemen." They watched him ride away, dust settling in his wake. "He was a coward during the war," Elijah said quietly. "Ran from the Battle of Corinth. Now he wears that star like he earned it." Later that afternoon, the brothers walked to the small wooden church at the edge of the freedmen's settlement. It was a simple building with a crooked cross above the door, but it stood as a testament to survival. Inside, Reverend Isaiah Samuels looked up from his worn Bible. Age had bent his back, but not his spirit. His face brightened at the sight of the twins. "Lord be praised," he said, rising slowly. "The Carter boys have returned." He embraced them both, his thin arms surprisingly strong. "Your father would be proud to see you." "We came for his Bible," Elias explained. "If it survived." Reverend Samuels nodded, moving to a small chest behind the altar. "Kept it safe all these years." He lifted out a leather-bound Bible, its cover scorched at the edges. Only thing that didn't burn that night. Elijah accepted it with careful hands. "Thank you." "Boys," Reverend Samuels said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you need to be careful. The Klan's riding again, and they mean to scare every black man back into the fields." His eyes darted to the windows. "They don't cotton to educated men like yourselves, especially ones who wore the blue." "We can take care of ourselves," Elijah assured him. "Pride before the fall," Samuels. "Your daddy was proud too." "We're not just proud," Elias said gently. "We're prepared." That night, in their half-built cabin, the brothers ate by lantern light. A tarp served as their roof, but it kept the evening dew at bay. Elias broke the cornbread while Elijah sliced dried meat with his pocket knife. "Reverend Samuels is right to worry," Elias said between bites. "We should be cautious." "Caution didn't win the war," Elijah replied. A rustle outside silenced them both. Something scraped against the new wooden door, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. Elijah raised his hand for silence, then reached for the shotgun leaning against the wall. He moved to the door in one fluid motion, pulling it open in a sudden jerk. No one stood outside, but a knife was embedded in the wood, pinning a folded piece of paper. Elijah yanked the knife free and brought the note to the lantern light. Unfolding it carefully, his expression remained stone still as he read the message aloud. "Leave by Sunday, or the night will claim you both." Elias's face paled in the lantern light. Sheriff Bixby didn't waste any time spreading word we're back. Elijah studied the handwriting, his finger tracing the curves of each letter. He set the note down on their makeshift table and calmly said, "They don't remember Shiloh." Elias looked at his brother, puzzled by the odd response. Something in Elijah's tone sent a chill down his spine, a cold certainty that reminded him of moments before battle when his brother became someone else entirely. He realized with growing unease that Elijah meant something darker than he was ready to face. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that promised hope. Elijah and Elias Carter walked the dirt path toward Reverend Samuels's church, their boots crunching on the gravel. Their Sunday clothes were simple but dignified: clean shirts, pressed trousers, and vests buttoned against the morning chill. Neither carried weapons, though Elijah's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. "Been a long time since we attended service together," Elias said, adjusting his collar. Elijah nodded. "Last time was before Antietam." The small wooden church came into view, its weathered cross leaning slightly with age. Outside, children played while adults gathered in small groups, their voices a gentle hum of conversation. When they spotted the Carter twins approaching, a hush fell over the crowd. Elijah straightened his back, his scarred face impassive. Elias offered a smile and a nod. "Good morning," Elias said, greeting an elderly woman who clutched her Bible to her chest. "Bless you boys for coming," she replied, her eyes darting nervously to the road beyond. Reverend Samuel stood at the church door, welcoming his congregation with handshakes and blessing. His face brightened when he saw the twins. "The Lord provides strength in numbers," he said, clasping each brother's hand firmly. "I'm glad you came." Inside, the church was simply furnished: wooden pews, a modest altar, and windows that let in streams of golden light. The twins took seats near the back, where Elijah could keep watch on both entrances. As they settled, Elias noticed several white men on horseback gathering across the road. They made no move to approach, but watched the church with obvious interest. "Trouble," he whispered to his brother. Elijah's jaw tightened. "Maybe." The service began with a hymn. Voices rose in harmony, filling the small space with sound. Reverend Samuels led them through Amazing Grace, his deep voice steady and sure. Elias sang along, while Elijah's lips barely moved, his attention divided between the hymnal and the windows. After the singing, the congregation bowed their heads for prayer. Reverend Samuels's voice washed over them. "Lord, we ask for your protection in these troubled times. Guide us through darkness into light. Shield us from those who would—" A crash shattered the peace as the back door splintered open. Men in white hoods burst in, swinging torches and chains. Women screamed. Children cried out in terror. "This gathering is over," shouted the tallest intruder, cracking a whip against a pew. Elijah moved with startling speed. He grabbed the nearest wooden pew and upended it, creating a barricade in front of 3 small children who had frozen in fear. "Behind me!" he ordered, pushing them toward the corner. Across the aisle, Elias tackled a hooded man who had raised a torch toward the curtains. They crashed to the floor, rolling in a tangle of limbs. The man's revolver clattered free. Elias lunged for it, his fingers closing around the grip, just as the attacker scrambled to his feet. "Drop it!" Elias commanded, the weapon steady in his hand. The church erupted in chaos. Another hooded figure swung a chain at Elijah, who ducked with practiced ease. In one fluid motion, Elijah grabbed the chain mid-swing and yanked hard. The attacker stumbled forward, off balance, and Elijah delivered a sharp blow to his temple. The man crumpled. A third attacker rushed at Elias from behind. Without looking, Elijah called out, "6 o'clock!" Elias spun and fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Splinters rained down as the man skidded to a stop. The twins moved in perfect coordination, positioning themselves back to back in the center aisle. Elijah had disarmed another attacker and now wielded the man's own club. "Like we did at Petersburg," Elijah said quietly. Elias nodded, understanding instantly. They moved as one unit, advancing steadily toward the remaining intruders. Their movements were disciplined, efficient, nothing like the desperate flailing of men unused to combat. "What the hell?" one hooded man gasped, backing away. "These ain't no ordinary—" "Fall back!" shouted the leader as Elijah advanced on him with cold precision. The remaining attackers scrambled out the door, leaving two of their companions unconscious on the church floor. Outside, horses whinnied as riders galloped away. In the sudden quiet, a woman whispered, "They move like soldiers, Union soldiers," another added, with newfound respect. Elijah knelt beside one unconscious attacker. "Let's see who's hiding under this hood." He yanked the white cloth away, revealing a young man with a ruddy face and expensive boots. "That's Thomas Macready," gasped Reverend Samuels, "Captain Silas Macready's nephew." "The banker's son?" someone asked. "The clan leader's kin," corrected an older man, his voice bitter. Elias checked the young man's pulse. "He's alive. Just knocked out." Elijah grabbed Thomas by his collar and dragged him outside, where the morning light exposed his face to all. The congregation followed, murmuring among themselves. "See his face," Elijah announced to the gathered witnesses. "Remember who came to burn your church." "Captain Macready won't stand for this," warned a woman, clutching her child close. "He'll bring the whole clan down on us." "On us," Elias corrected gently. "We're all in this together now." As the crowd began to disperse, heading back to the safety of their homes, Reverend Samuels approached the twins. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were clear. "You must leave," he pleaded, "before nightfall. What you did was brave, but they'll come back in greater numbers." Elijah looked toward the tree line where torches flickered in the distance. Someone was watching, waiting. "We've been hunted before," Elijah replied, his voice level and calm. The Reverend followed his gaze, seeing the distant torchlight. His shoulders slumped as understanding dawned. This confrontation was far from over. The clan had been humiliated today, and men like Captain Macready did not forgive such insults. Whatever peace had existed in Rosewood Crossing had just been shattered beyond repair. Midnight painted the delta in shades of blue-black. A half-moon hung between wisps of clouds, casting just enough light for the Carter brothers to work by. Behind their half-built cabin, Elijah led Thomas Macready's horse into the small shed they'd constructed days earlier. "Easy now," Elias whispered, stroking the animal's muzzle as it snorted nervously. The horse was fine stock, expensive leather saddle, polished bridle, a rich man's mount. Elijah emerged from the shed, dusting his hands. "No brands, smart, nothing to trace back." "What about this?" Elias held up the white hood they'd taken from Thomas. The cloth seemed to glow in the moonlight, its empty eye holes staring back at them. "Bury it," Elijah said. "Deep, under the cypress." They walked to the ancient cypress that stood at the edge of their property, its massive roots spreading like fingers into the soil. Elias dug while Elijah kept watch, listening for hoofbeats or voices in the night. "They'll come looking," Elias said, tamping down the dirt over the buried hood. "Let them." Elijah's voice was calm but cold. "They won't find anything." "They don't need to find anything. You know that." Elias straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "They just need an excuse." Elijah nodded toward the distant tree line. "They're already gathering." Through the trees, pinpricks of torchlight flickered like fireflies. The clan was regrouping, and even from this distance, the brothers could feel their anger burning. Captain Silas Macready paced before his men, fury radiating from him like heat from a furnace. His white robe was discarded. Tonight, he wore his old Confederate officer's coat, faded but still bearing his captain's insignia. 20 men stood in a loose circle, faces lit by the central bonfire. "My own nephew," Macready spat, "beaten and humiliated in front of the whole colored church." He slammed his fist into his palm. "And you ran! Like dogs!" "They weren't normal, Captain," protested one man, his lips swollen from the fight. "They moved like—" "Like what? Soldiers?" Macready sneered. "Those two blacks think they're better men than God made 'em." He looked around the circle, his eyes hard. "Well, I aim to correct that misunderstanding." Thomas Macready sat apart from the others, holding a cloth to his bruised temple. His pride hurt worse than his head. "Uncle," he called, "they took my horse, my good mare." Silas turned, his face tightening. "We'll get it back, along with everything else they think they can take." He addressed the group. "Those twins have forgotten their place. By week's end, I want their land burned to ash. Nothing left but smoke." The men nodded, muttering agreement. Silas picked up a bottle of whiskey, took a long pull, then passed it around the circle. "To justice," he said, watching the flames leap higher. "To justice," the men echoed, the firelight catching in their eyes. The next evening, as dusk settled over the delta, 5 freedmen families gathered in the Carters' half-built cabin. They sat on upturned crates and unfinished floorboards, speaking in hushed tones. "They'll come for all of us," said Marcus Jenkins, a former field hand who now worked his own small plot. "You stood against them, and they'll make everyone pay." "Not if we're smart," Elijah replied, unrolling a crude map of the area on the floor. "Not if we're prepared." Elias lit a second lantern and placed it by the window, its light visible from the road. "First rule, communication. If you see riders, 3 quick flashes with a covered lantern, like this." He demonstrated, covering and uncovering the lantern in rapid succession. "What if we ain't got no lantern?" asked an older woman, her hands knotted with arthritis. Elijah pulled out a hymnal from the church. Between its pages, he'd inserted small slips of paper. "Second page, 3rd verse of Swing Low. Circle the words you need. Pass the book to someone coming to church." "And if they catch us with those messages?" asked Jenkins. "Eat them," Elijah said flatly. "Paper won't kill you. Klansmen will." As the night deepened, Elijah led the men outside. By moonlight, he showed them how to string tripwires between trees, how to dig shallow pits and cover them with brush. He demonstrated how tin cans filled with pebbles made effective alarms when disturbed. "I learned this building trenches at Petersburg," he explained, knotting a thin wire. "The Rebs never saw us coming." Inside, Elias worked with the women and older children. "Stay low. Move quiet. No lights at night, unless it's a signal. Keep the little ones close." "What about the school?" asked a mother, her young daughter clutching her skirts. "They'll burn it, sure." "School stays open," Elias insisted. "By day, everything looks normal. That's our protection. Let them think we're scared but compliant." "Ain't we scared?" asked the woman. "Yes," Elias admitted, "but there's a difference between being scared and being helpless." For 3 nights, they worked. By day, Elias taught children their letters and numbers in the small lean-to schoolhouse. By night, Elijah trained the men in silent movement, in signals, in watchfulness. They established code words. Weather meant clan movement. Harvest meant gather weapons. Sermon meant hide. The freedmen learned quickly. Their lives depended on it. Elijah spent his evenings crafting more elaborate defenses, hidden platforms in trees, covered pits, and alarm systems made from scrap metal and twine. His time as a Union sapper served him well. He knew how to make the land itself into a weapon. "You enjoy this too much," Elias observed on the 3rd night, watching his brother set a particularly clever spring trap. Elijah didn't look up from his work. "I enjoy staying alive." The 4th night was moonless, the darkness complete. Elijah sat on the cabin's roof, a covered lantern by his side. His eyes, accustomed to night watches in Virginia's woods, picked out shapes in the gloom. There, movement on the north road. He opened the lantern shutter, flashed it 3 times, then closed it completely. Seconds later, an answering flash came from Jenkins's cabin a quarter-mile away. Hoofbeats now, soft but growing louder. 6 riders, maybe 7, moving slowly. They were being cautious. Elijah slid down from the roof, landing silently on the packed earth. He moved to the edge of their property, where the first line of defenses began. Hidden in the brush, he waited. The riders approached, their forms gradually taking shape in the darkness. White hoods gleamed faintly despite the absence of moonlight. The lead rider held up his hand, signaling the others to stop. "Check the cabin," a voice whispered. "See if they're inside." 2 riders moved forward. Elijah held his breath, counting their steps. 1, 2, 3. A soft jingle broke the silence as a horse's hoof struck the buried alarm bells. The animal snorted, sensing something wrong. "What was that?" hissed a rider. Elijah pulled the trip line. The cord, nearly invisible in the darkness, snapped taut across the path. The horses hit it at knee height, exactly as Elijah had planned. 2 animals went down immediately, throwing their riders. A third reared in panic, its front hooves pawing the air. "Ambush!" someone shouted. "It's a trap!" Confusion erupted as the clansmen struggled to control their mounts. More alarm bells jangled as the horses trampled through the carefully laid warning system. Elijah smiled grimly in the darkness. The first trap had been sprung, and the night was just beginning. From the shadows around the property, he knew other eyes were watching, other hands ready. The clan had come hunting, unaware they'd become the hunted. The full moon broke through the clouds, casting an eerie silver light over the chaos. Horses screamed, their eyes wild with panic as they reared and bucked. 2 clansmen lay sprawled on the ground where they'd been thrown, while others struggled to control their mounts. "Get them! Don't let them escape!" shouted one of the hooded figures, his voice shaking with rage. Elijah crouched behind a fallen log, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He struck a match and lit the fuse of a small clay pot packed with damp leaves and powder, a smoke bomb he'd learned to make during the siege of Vicksburg. "Cover your eyes," he whispered to the freedman crouching beside him, then hurled the pot. It landed among the clansmen with a dull thud before erupting in thick, choking smoke. From the other side of the clearing, Elias raised their father's old Springfield rifle and fired a single shot into the air. The crack echoed through the trees, sending the already panicked horses into a frenzy. More shots rang out, not from the brothers, but from the freedmen positioned around the perimeter. They weren't aiming to kill, just firing into the air as Elijah had instructed. In the confusion, it sounded like a dozen rifles instead of 3. "We're surrounded!" one of the clansmen cried out, coughing through the thickening smoke. "Fall back! Fall back!" ordered another, wheeling his horse around. The riders retreated in disarray, leaving behind 2 of their companions still stunned from their falls. One horse limped after its fleeing master, while another stood trembling, reins trailing in the dirt. Elijah emerged from the shadows, his scarred face eerily calm. "Tie them up," he ordered, nodding toward the fallen men. Marcus Jenkins and 2 other freedmen quickly bound the clansman's hands with rope. One was unconscious, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. The other struggled weakly, his hood askew. "You'll hang for this," the conscious man. "You'll all hang." Elijah knelt beside him and pulled off the man's hood, revealing the pale, freckled face of a boy barely 20 years old. "No one's hanging tonight," he said quietly. "At least, not us." As the last sounds of the retreating riders faded, Elias approached his brother, lowering his rifle. "That was too close," he muttered. "No," Elijah replied, gathering the dropped hoods from the ground. "That was exactly what I planned." Dawn broke with a pale, watery light. Dew clung to the Spanish moss hanging from the cypress trees, making the world seem draped in silver. The brothers stood in their yard, surveying what the night had left behind. 3 white hoods, a dropped revolver, a broken torch, and 2 captured horses, now tethered to their fence post. Elias ran his hand along one horse's flank, feeling the expensive leather of the saddle. "This is Judge Watkins's gelding," he said softly. "He'll miss it." "Let him come looking for it," Elijah replied, collecting the abandoned weapons. His tone was matter-of-fact, without bravado or fear. Elias sighed heavily, watching his twin. "You know what this means. We've gone too far now. They won't just threaten anymore. This was defense, brother." Elijah checked the chamber of the captured revolver before tucking it into his belt. "Nothing more." "And those?" Elias nodded toward the barn, where the 2 captured clansmen were being held. "Information," Elijah said simply, then started walking toward the barn. Inside, Marcus Jenkins stood guard with a pitchfork. The younger clansman sat with his back against the wall, his hands tied before him. The older one still hadn't regained consciousness, lying on a pile of straw. "Who are you?" Elijah asked the conscious prisoner. "Go to hell," the young man spat. Elijah knelt before him, his voice level and controlled. "I've been to hell already. 4 years of it. Petersburg, the wilderness, Cold Harbor. I've seen men beg for death." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I don't want to hear you beg." The young man's defiance faltered. "What's Silas planning next?" Elijah pressed. The prisoner swallowed hard. "I don't know nothing about no plans." Elijah took out his pocket knife and began cleaning his fingernails. "Wrong answer." It took less than 10 minutes of Elijah's quiet, methodical questions before the young man broke. Words poured out between sobs. How Captain Silas was gathering every clan member from 3 counties. How they planned to burn out all the freedmen on Saturday night. A purge to cleanse the county. "He says it'll be like old times," the young man whispered, "when no colored man dared raise his eyes." Elijah listened silently, then stood. "We have 3 days," he said to Elias, who had been watching from the doorway. "3 days until what?" Elias asked, following his brother outside. Elijah didn't answer. By afternoon, rain clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a storm. Elias finished his day's teaching at the small school, sending the children home early with warnings to stay close to their cabins. He found Elijah sitting on the porch steps, whittling small pieces of pine wood with his knife. Curious, Elias sat beside him. "What are you making?" he asked. Elijah held up a small wooden figure, crude but recognizable as a man. Next to him sat another, already completed. "Reminders," he said. Elias picked up one of the figurines, turning it over in his hands. With a chill, he realized each represented one of the clansmen they'd encountered. The one with the broken leg, the unconscious one in their barn. "This isn't like you, Elijah," he said softly. "Keeping count like this? War changes what's like you," Elijah replied, his knife continuing its careful work. "You know that better than most." Elias set the figure down, unsettled by the growing darkness he sensed in his brother. "What happened to the prisoners?" he asked, suddenly realizing he hadn't seen Marcus since midday. "Handled," Elijah said, not looking up from his carving. "Elijah." Elias's voice was firm now. "What did you do?" Elijah finally raised his eyes. "What had to be done?" Behind the barn, freshly turned earth marked 2 narrow graves. No markers, no ceremony, just practical necessity. The brothers had seen enough death in the war to handle it efficiently. "They'd have killed us all," Elijah said simply, returning to his carving. "You know that." Elias couldn't argue. Instead, he picked up a piece of wood and his own knife and began to carve alongside his brother. Neither spoke for a long time. As evening approached, heavy clouds rolled in from the west. Lightning flashed over the swamp, illuminating the twisted shapes of cypress trees. The air smelled of rain and ozone. Elijah stood at the edge of their property, studying the horizon where distant torches flickered despite the coming storm. The clan was gathering, just as the young man had said. "They'll come in force next time," Elias said, joining his brother. "Let them." Elijah's scarred face looked carved from stone in the harsh light of the approaching storm. "They think they're the hunters." His eyes narrowed as lightning flashed again. "Let's remind them who survived the war." The first heavy raindrops began to fall, pattering on the leaves around them. Neither man moved to seek shelter. They stood shoulder to shoulder, two shadows against the coming darkness, as thunder rolled across the delta like distant cannon fire. Morning light filtered through the cypress trees, casting dappled shadows on the gathering behind Reverend Samuels's small church. 24 freedmen huddled in a nervous circle, speaking in hushed tones. Elijah and Elias stood at the center, unfolding a rough map drawn on tanned leather. "We need every path watched," Elijah explained, his finger tracing escape routes through the swampland. "Every cabin needs signal lanterns ready. When they come, they'll come from all sides." The men nodded solemnly. Most were field workers, not soldiers, but determination hardened their faces. Among them stood Caleb Turner, a thin man in his 20s with a perpetual nervousness about him. Unlike the others, he wouldn't meet the Carter brothers' eyes. "Caleb," Elias said kindly, "you know the marshlands better than most. Can your family host the signal fire on the eastern ridge?" Caleb shifted his weight, staring at the ground. "Yes, sir," he mumbled. "We can do that." Elijah watched him with narrowed eyes, noting the sweat beading on Caleb's forehead despite the morning cool. Something wasn't right. Marcus Jenkins spoke up. "My boys can hide supplies in the old fishing shed. Nobody goes there since the flood." As the planning continued, Elias noticed Caleb backing away from the group. The young man glanced over his shoulder, then slipped behind the church toward the cotton fields. Most were too engaged in discussion to notice, but Elijah caught his brother's eye with a subtle nod. "Keep them talking," Elijah whispered. "I'll be back." Elias cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the map. "Let's talk about gathering places," he said loudly. "If we're separated, where do we meet?" While the conversation continued, Elijah moved silently around the church's edge. Years of battlefield reconnaissance had taught him to step without sound, to blend with shadows. He followed Caleb's path through the tall cotton plants. A quarter-mile from the church, Caleb stopped at a small clearing where two riders waited, their faces hidden by low-pulled hats. Elijah crouched behind a thick stand of cotton, close enough to hear their hushed conversation. "They're planning something big," Caleb whispered urgently. "The Carter brothers, they've got the others believing they can fight back." One of the riders leaned forward. "Details, boy. What exactly are they planning?" "They're setting up watchers, signal fires. They mentioned supplies hidden in the old fishing shed." Caleb's voice trembled. "Please, I've told you what I know. My wife—" "She'll be fine as long as you keep bringing us information," the other rider cut in. "Captain Silas wants to know their every move." Elijah had heard enough. He circled silently behind Caleb as the riders departed, then stepped out when the young man turned to leave. "Caleb," he said softly. The younger man froze, terror washing across his face. "Mr. Carter, I was just betraying us." Elijah's voice remained calm, which somehow made it more frightening. "I heard everything." Caleb fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "They have my Sarah. Said they'd hurt her if I didn't tell them things." His words tumbled out between sobs. "They caught me on the road 3 days ago. Said they'd burn her alive if I didn't help them. Please, Mr. Carter, I got a baby girl too." Elijah's hand had moved to the knife at his belt, but he paused, studying Caleb's terrified face. After a long silence, he removed his hand from the weapon. "Stand up," he ordered. Caleb obeyed shakily, preparing for the worst. "Your family. Where are they now?" "At my cabin. Silas has men watching." Elijah nodded slowly, his mind working. "You're going to continue meeting them?" Caleb blinked in confusion. "Sir?" "You're going to tell them exactly what I tell you to tell them." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Elijah's scarred face. "And in return, I promise, your family will be safe." Understanding dawned in Caleb's eyes. "You want me to be a double agent?" "I want you to help me set a trap," Elijah corrected. "Now, walk with me. We have plans to make." When Elijah returned to the church with Caleb, the meeting was breaking up. Elias noticed his brother's hand resting casually on the younger man's shoulder, a gesture that could be either comforting or threatening. "Everything all right?" Elias asked when the others had gone. "Caleb has something to tell you," Elijah said, giving the man a gentle push forward. In halting words, Caleb confessed his betrayal, explaining how the clan had coerced him. Elias's expression shifted from shock to sympathy as he listened. "I don't blame you for protecting your family," Elias finally said. "But this changes things. It creates an opportunity," Elijah countered. "Caleb will feed them false information. A shipment of rifles arriving Friday night by wagon from Vicksburg. Enough weapons to arm every freedman in the county." Elias caught on quickly. "Bait. Draw them out where we choose." "Exactly." Elijah squeezed Caleb's shoulder. "And our friend here will make sure they believe every word." Caleb nodded, a mixture of shame and relief on his face. "I'll do whatever you need, Mr. Carter. Just keep my family safe." "We'll move them tonight," Elijah promised. "To the old trapper's cabin. No one will find them there." After Caleb left, Elias turned to his brother. "That was merciful of you. I half expected to find his body in the cotton field." "This isn't about mercy," Elijah replied. "It's strategy. He's more useful alive." Elias studied his twin, troubled by the cold calculation in his voice. "Is that all any of us are to you now? Useful or not?" Elijah didn't answer, just walked away toward their cabin. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Elias found himself at Reverend Samuels's door. The old man sat on his porch, Bible open on his lap. "Something troubling you, son?" the Reverend asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. Elias sank into it with a heavy sigh. "It's Elijah. He's changing, Reverend. Or maybe the war changed him, and I'm only now seeing it." The old man nodded slowly. "War does things to a man's soul, breaks pieces off that never grow back. We've bought some time with this plan. Silas will focus on this fake shipment, give us room to prepare." Elias rubbed his eyes. "But I'm afraid of what Elijah's preparing. The look in his eyes, it's not defense anymore. It's vengeance." Reverend Samuels closed his Bible. "There's a fine line between justice and vengeance, son. One heals, the other consumes." He placed a weathered hand on Elias's arm. "Be careful. A man can win a war and still lose his soul. What would you have me do? Remind him what you're fighting for, not just against." The Reverend's eyes were sad, but knowing. "And pray. The Lord sees every sparrow that falls. I'm not sure if God's watching this corner of Mississippi, Reverend." "He is." The old man's certainty was unshakable, even when his justice seemed slow in coming. Sunset painted the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple as Elias sat at their small table, writing lesson plans by lamplight. Tomorrow, he would teach the children about fractions using apple slices, if there was still a tomorrow to be had. Behind him, Elijah packed a canvas satchel, powder kegs, fuses, mining caps from their Union days, tools of destruction wrapped carefully in cloth. "Where are you going?" Elias asked without turning. "Better you don't know," Elijah replied, buckling the satchel closed. "We're brothers. We don't keep secrets." Elijah paused at the door. "Some burdens aren't meant to be shared." With that, he slipped out into the gathering darkness. Elias sat motionless, listening as his brother's footsteps faded into the forest. Soon came the distant sound of hammering, echoing faintly through the trees. Elias stared at his lesson notes, the letters blurring before his eyes. Whatever Elijah was building out there in the dark, it wasn't meant for teaching or healing. It was meant to destroy. 2 nights later, Friday evening settled over the Mississippi Delta like a funeral shroud. A half-moon hung low, casting just enough light to transform the swamp into a maze of silver and shadow. Crickets sang their endless song, occasionally falling silent when something moved through the underbrush. A lone wagon creaked down the old logging trail, its wheels sinking into mud before pulling free with wet, sucking sounds. 2 freedmen sat on the driver's bench, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the darkness. The wagon was loaded with wooden crates, empty ones, though no one would know that until they were opened. This was the bait, the false arms shipment, half a mile away, hidden among cypress knees and hanging moss. Elijah and Elias Carter waited. They lay flat on their stomachs, atop a small rise overlooking the boggy clearing where the trail widened. Elijah's hands were black with mud and gunpowder. For 3 days, he'd worked in secret, burying barrels of Union black powder beneath the soft earth of the swamp, salvaged from caches he'd hidden during the war. "They're coming," Elias whispered, pointing to faint torchlight flickering between distant trees. Elijah nodded. "Right on time." His voice was flat, emotionless. He'd been like this since catching Caleb, focused, mechanical, as if some vital part of his humanity had been tucked away for safekeeping. The brothers watched as riders emerged from the tree line, at least 20 men in white hoods, led by the unmistakable figure of Captain Silas McCready. Even without his Confederate uniform, Silas rode tall in the saddle, back straight as a ramrod. His hood was marked with a red cross, setting him apart from his men. "I count 23, Elias murmured. 24, Elijah corrected, pointing to a smaller figure trailing behind the main group. "That's Thomas, the nephew." The wagon stopped in the clearing as planned. The 2 freedmen drivers jumped down, pretending to check a broken wheel. Right on cue, Silas's men surrounded them, rifles drawn, torches held high. "Look what we found, boys!" Silas's voice carried across the swamp. "The rifles our little spy told us about." The freedmen raised their hands, playing their parts perfectly. They would be allowed to escape. That was part of the plan. The clan wanted the weapons, not 2 more bodies to explain. "Run!" one of the drivers shouted to the other, and they bolted into the trees, directly away from where the brothers hid. Silas laughed as his men swarmed the wagon, prying open crates with the butts of their rifles. Confusion spread quickly. "Empty!" someone shouted. "They're all empty!" Rage twisted Silas's voice. "It's a trick! Find those drivers!" In the distance, signal fires began to flicker to life. 1, then 3, then a dozen pinpricks of light on the surrounding ridges. Every freedman family for miles had lit their signal, creating the illusion of an army gathering in the night. Silas saw the fires and raised his arm. "We're surrounded! Form up!" Panic spread through the hooded men as they struggled to organize, horses stomping nervously in the boggy ground. They didn't realize they were standing exactly where Elijah wanted them, directly above his buried powder kegs. "Now?" Elias asked, his voice barely audible. Elijah's eyes reflected the distant torchlight as he reached for the fuse line hidden beneath leaves and mud. "Now." With steady hands, he struck a match and touched it to the fuse. The small flame caught, then began crawling away from them, following the hidden line toward the clearing. For several seconds, nothing seemed to happen. The clan continued shouting, torches waving as they formed a defensive circle. Then the earth itself seemed to take a breath. The explosion began not as one blast, but as a series. a rippling chain of thunderous roars that lifted men and horses into the air. Fire erupted from the mud itself, shooting geysers of flame and debris into the night sky. Screams cut through the cacophony as riders and mounts were thrown in all directions. The wagon disintegrated. Trees splintered and fell. A second wave of explosions followed the first, catching those who had survived the initial blast. Elias stared in horror and awe. This wasn't just a trap. It was annihilation. The clearing had transformed into a scene from hell itself, flames reflecting off the swamp water, turning it blood-red. "Come on," Elijah said, already backing away. "We need to move." Elias couldn't tear his eyes from the carnage. All those men! Who would have killed every last one of us? Elijah grabbed his brother's arm. "Move!" As they retreated, a massive oak, its roots blown loose by the blasts, groaned and toppled. A jagged branch caught Elijah across the face, slicing from forehead to cheekbone. He cried out, hands flying to his eye. Elias rushed to his brother's side, pulling him away as burning debris rained down around them. Blood poured between Elijah's fingers, but he wasn't finished watching. He turned back toward the inferno, one hand pressed to his ruined eye, and smiled grimly. "It's done," he whispered. Thunder rumbled overhead. The summer sky, clear minutes before, had filled with sudden storm clouds. Rain began to fall, fat drops hissing as they hit the burning wreckage. Nature itself seemed eager to wash away what had happened here. The brothers staggered through the woods as the storm intensified, lightning illuminating their path in stark flashes. Neither spoke. What was there to say? The plan had worked perfectly, too perfectly. The trap had sprung, and the hunters were destroyed. Behind them, the swamp continued to burn despite the rain, sending a column of black smoke into the night sky. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the scent of scorched flesh and burning wood. It was a smell both brothers recognized from battlefields they'd hoped never to revisit. Dawn broke gray and misty as they finally limped back to their cabin. Elijah's face was a mask of dried blood, his left eye swollen shut. Elias helped him inside and eased him onto the bed. "Let me see," he said gently, dipping a cloth into their water barrel. Elijah didn't resist, as his brother cleaned the wound. The cut was deep, the eye beneath possibly blinded forever. Yet Elijah showed no pain, no regret, just the same distant focus that had driven him for days. "It's over," Elias said softly, wringing bloody water from the cloth. Elijah stared at the ceiling with his one good eye. "No," he replied. "It's just quiet." Morning fog hung thick over Rosewood Crossing, turning the town into a ghostly landscape of half-visible buildings and muted sounds. The swamp fire had finally died during the night, but smoke still curled lazily above the tree line, mixing with the mist. Birds were oddly silent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The first sign of trouble came with the distant clatter of hooves on the main road. 3 riders emerged from the fog, men in dark coats with federal badges pinned to their chests. They rode directly to the sheriff's office, their expressions grave beneath wide-brimmed hats. Sheriff Harlan Bixby met them on the porch, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous energy. He'd heard the explosions that rocked the night, same as everyone else. And, like everyone else, he had a fair idea what had happened out in those swamps. "Sheriff," the lead marshal nodded curtly. "I'm Marshal James Hayward. We've received reports about explosions and missing men. Seems your town had some excitement last night." Bixby shifted his weight, eyes darting to the gathering crowd of curious townspeople. "Moonshine still, most likely, happens now and again." Marshal Hayward's eyes narrowed. 20 men don't vanish because of a still explosion, Sheriff." Within the hour, the marshals were riding toward the Carter property, Bixby trailing reluctantly behind. The small cabin looked peaceful in the morning light, smoke rising from its chimney. Elias stood in the doorway as they approached, his face carefully blank. "Federal Marshals," Hayward announced, dismounting. "We need to ask some questions about last night's events." Elias nodded, stepping aside to let them enter. "My brother was injured. He's resting." Inside, Elijah lay on a simple cot, his left eye covered with a bandage stained with dried blood. The cabin was spotless. Too clean, the marshals might have thought, had they known what to look for. No powder residue, no weapons in sight. Just a teacher and his wounded brother. "Quite a commotion last night," Marshal Hayward began, removing his hat. "Mind telling us what happened?" Elias poured coffee with steady hands. "We were attacked. Men on horseback. Seemed like the same ones who've been threatening us since we arrived." "Klansmen?" Hayward asked directly. "I couldn't say for certain," Elias replied. "They wore hoods." Bixby cleared his throat. "Ain't been no Klan activity round here that I know of." Elias met the sheriff's eyes calmly. "Strange, then, how our church was attacked just last week. How we found threatening notes on our door." "From the bed," Elijah spoke, his voice raspy but clear. "They came for us last night. We ran into the swamp, heard explosions behind us." He touched his bandaged eye. "A branch caught me as we fled." The marshals exchanged glances. They'd seen the clearing that morning, a crater of blackened earth and splintered trees, scattered with bits of cloth, metal, and worse things they chose not to examine closely. "That's quite a coincidence," Hayward said, not hiding his skepticism. "You flee into the very swamp that explodes minutes later." Elias shrugged. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. And where would a bunch of night riders get that much black powder?" another marshal asked. "War left a lot of dangerous things buried," Elijah answered, his good eye fixed on the ceiling. "Careless men with torches riding over old battlefields. Who knows what they might trigger?" The questioning continued for another hour. The marshals probed for inconsistency, but found none. The brothers' story was simple, plausible, and impossible to disprove. They were victims who had fled for their lives, nothing more. When the marshals finally left, Bixby lingered in the doorway, his face twisted with a mix of fear and anger. "I know you did something," he hissed. "Men don't just disappear." "Like black folks disappeared during the war, Sheriff," Elias asked quietly. "Like my father disappeared when his cabin burned?" Bixby's hand twitched toward his gun, then fell away. "This ain't over." "You're right," Elijah called from his bed. "It's just beginning." The sheriff left, mounting his horse with clumsy haste. By afternoon, the marshals had completed their official report. Accidental combustion of illegal distillery operations resulting in multiple casualties. Without bodies to identify or witnesses willing to speak, there was little more they could do. Captain Silas McCready was listed among the missing, presumed dead. His body, like many others, was never recovered from the swamp. As evening fell, a different kind of gathering formed outside the Carter cabin. Freedmen and their families arrived silently, each carrying food or lanterns. They stood in a loose circle, their faces solemn in the gathering darkness. Then, softly at first, they began to sing. An old spiritual about crossing the River Jordan, about freedom on the other side. Elias stepped onto the porch, visibly moved by their presence. Behind him, Elijah sat in the doorway, bandaged face half in shadow. When the song ended, Elias addressed them. "What happened in the swamp stays buried there. Let the fire die here. Our fight now is to build schools, homes, futures for our children." His voice grew stronger. "That's what my father would have wanted. That's what we all fought for." Murmurs of agreement spread through the gathering. One by one, the freedmen approached, offering handshakes to Elias and respectful nods to the wounded Elijah. Women left covered dishes on the porch. Children placed wildflowers in a jar by the door. As they dispersed into the night, Their lanterns formed a constellation of moving stars across the darkened fields, a mirror to the sky above. Inside the cabin, Elijah sat alone by the hearth, a small knife in his hand and a block of pine wood in his lap. His fingers moved with practiced precision despite his injury, shaving away tiny curls of wood. Gradually, a shape emerged. Not another hooded figure like the others he had carved, but a child holding an open book. Beside his chair sat a small wooden box, its lid closed tight. Inside lay 24 tiny figurines, each carved to represent a clansman who had ridden into the swamp. Elijah ran his thumb over the newly carved child, feeling the smooth lines of the face and the tiny ridges of the book. Without a word, he rose, tucked the box under his arm, and walked outside. The night was cool and clear, stars bright overhead. He crossed to the edge of their property, where the field met forest, to a patch of freshly turned earth beside the charred remains of their father's original cabin. Kneeling, he placed the box into a small hole he had dug earlier, covered it with dirt, and tamped it down firmly with the flat of his hand. The past, buried where it belonged. When he returned, the carved child sat on the mantelpiece, facing east, toward the sunrise that would come tomorrow. 2 years later, spring sunshine bathed the red brick schoolhouse that stood proudly on what had once been the Carter family land. Fresh white paint gleamed on the window frames and door, catching the light like a beacon. Children's voices, black and a few poor white children whose parents valued education over old hatreds, spilled from the open windows, mingling with bird song and the distant clatter of wagons on the main road. The schoolyard bustled with activity as youngsters played during their midday break. Jump ropes slapped against packed dirt, and a makeshift baseball game unfolded in the far corner. Laughter, pure and unburdened, floated on the spring breeze. Behind the schoolhouse, in a carefully tended garden plot, Elijah Carter worked the soil with practiced hands. His left eye remained permanently closed. The scar tissue puckered across his cheek and brow. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face as he methodically pulled weeds from between rows of spring vegetables, carrots, onions, and early tomatoes staked with twine. Though partially blind, his movements were precise, guided by memory and touch more than sight. Inside the schoolhouse, Elias stood before 20 students, a piece of chalk in hand, as he explained fractions on the blackboard. His voice was calm and patient, his examples drawn from practical matters, dividing supplies, measuring lumber, calculating crop yields. Education with purpose. 2/4 equals 1/2, he demonstrated, drawing the equation. Just like 2/4 make 50 cents. Who can tell me what 3/6 equals? Several hands shot up. Elias nodded to a small girl in the front row. That's 1/2 too, Mr. Carter. Excellent, Mary. And why is that? Because you can reduce it. 3 goes into 3 once, and 3 goes into 6 twice. So it's 1/2. Elias smiled. Perfect explanation. As the lesson continued, a rider appeared at the edge of the property. A thin white man in a city suit, notepad tucked in his breast pocket, dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post. He watched the school for several minutes, scribbling occasional notes, before approaching the garden where Elijah worked. Mr. Carter? The stranger called. Elijah straightened slowly, turning his good eye toward the voice. Depends who's asking. James Wilcox, Mississippi Herald, the man replied, offering his hand. When Elijah didn't take it, he awkwardly withdrew it and pulled out his notepad instead. I'm writing about reconstruction efforts in the Delta. Your school is becoming quite well known. Elijah wiped his hands on his trousers. My brother handles visitors. He's teaching now. Actually, I'm more interested in what happened 2 years ago, Wilcox pressed. The night the Klan disappeared in Rosewood Crossing. Folks say all manner of things, Elijah interrupted, turning back to his garden. Most ain't worth the air it takes to speak them. The journalist didn't leave. 24 men vanished that night. The official report called it a moonshine accident. But everyone knows. You writing a story about our school or about ghost tales? Elijah's voice hardened. Both, perhaps, Wilcox said, undeterred. How a school rose from the ashes of tragedy. How two freedmen stood against terror and somehow survived. Elijah's hand tightened around his garden trowel. My brother will speak with you after lesson's end. Now, if you'll excuse me, these carrots won't tend themselves. The journalist retreated to the shade of an old oak to wait, watching as Elijah resumed his methodical work, apparently forgetting his presence entirely. When the school day ended 2 hours later, children streamed from the building, books clutched to chests, voices calling goodbyes. Elias stood in the doorway, waving as they dispersed down various paths toward home. Noticing the stranger, he approached with cautious politeness. "Can I help you, sir?" Wilcox introduced himself again, explaining his purpose. Elias listened carefully, then gestured toward a wooden bench beneath the oak. "I'm happy to talk about our school," he said, sitting down. "It's become something special for this community." "And the other matter? The night the clan vanished?" Wilcox had his pencil ready. Elias looked toward his brother, still working in the garden. "Some things are best left to history. But surely you have thoughts on how an entire clan chapter could disappear in one night? Some call it divine intervention." A small smile touched Elias's lips. "I believe in justice, Mr. Wilcox. Sometimes it comes through courts and laws. Sometimes it comes through other means. Were you and your brother involved in what happened?" "We were here. We survived." Elias's gaze drifted to the swamp in the distance. "That's all any official inquiry found. And it's all you'll find, too." Wilcox leaned closer. "But the rumors that Union veterans took revenge, that the swamp itself rose up against evil men, stories keep the living safe," Elias replied quietly. "Truth keeps the dead awake. Which would you prefer for your readers?" The journalist studied him, then wrote something in his notepad. "Was it God's justice, then? Is that what you believe happened?" Elias nodded slowly. "God's justice, yes. Through human hands, as it often comes." When Wilcox finally left an hour later, his notepad was filled with details about the school, its curriculum, its students' progress, its hopes for the future, and just enough mystery about that fateful night to sell newspapers across 3 counties. As dusk approached, Elias locked the schoolhouse door and crossed to the garden where Elijah still worked, now collecting early spring greens in a small basket. "You ready to head home, brother?" he asked. Elijah nodded, rising stiffly. "That journalist get what he wanted?" "He got a story. Maybe not the one he came for." The brothers walked side by side down the path toward their cabin, now expanded and properly finished with a stone chimney and glass windows. They passed beneath the spreading branches of an ancient cypress, where, 2 years earlier, they had buried a clansman's hood. The spot was marked now by a simple wooden cross, weathered by sun and rain, carved with a single word: freedom. Elijah paused before it, his good eye tracing the letters. "You think that reporter's story will bring trouble?" he asked quietly. Elias shook his head. "No, it'll just become another legend. How the ghosts of Rosewood punish the wicked." "Ghosts," Elijah repeated, a trace of irony in his voice. "Is that what we are now?" "To some." Elias touched his brother's shoulder. "To these children, we're just teachers. To the freedmen, neighbors. That's enough." They continued walking as the first stars appeared overhead. Behind them, the schoolhouse stood silhouetted against the twilight sky. A promise kept, a future secured. The night was peaceful now. No hoofbeats disturbed the darkness, no torches flickered in the distance. Whatever ghosts remained kept their silence, watching over the land they had reclaimed with blood and fire. The red brick of the Carter School gleamed in the autumn sunlight of 1881, weathered by a decade but standing proud. What had begun as a single-room schoolhouse now boasted 3 classrooms, a small library, and a bell tower that called children to lessons each morning. Maples and oaks, planted years earlier, had grown tall enough to cast cooling shade across the yard, where nearly 50 students now gathered daily. Inside the headmaster's office, Elias Carter, his beard now streaked with gray, reviewed the term's curriculum notes. At 60, his hands showed the first tremors of age, but his mind remained sharp. The walls around him displayed framed photographs of graduating classes, certificates of achievement, and a single faded Union cap hung on a wooden peg. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, setting aside his papers. Naomi Green entered, carrying a stack of composition books. At 26, she embodied the school's future. Born after the war, raised in freedom, educated at Fisk University. Her dark hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, and she wore a high-collared blue dress that rustled softly as she moved. "I've finished grading the essays, Mr. Carter," she said, placing the books on his desk. "The older children show remarkable improvement." Elias smiled, gesturing for her to take a seat. "You've done wonders with them, Miss Green. When did you say the new geography texts would arrive?" "Next week, if the mail coach runs on schedule." She settled into the chair, but her eyes drifted to the window, where Elijah Carter could be seen in the distance, walking slowly among the garden rows. Elias followed her gaze. "My brother's checking the pumpkins. The children are planning harvest decorations." Naomi nodded, hesitating before speaking again. "Mr. Carter, I've been here 3 months now, and the students often whisper stories." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Stories about you and your brother, about what happened here during Reconstruction." "Children love tales," Elias replied mildly. "It's not just the children." She leaned forward slightly. "In town, they say the Carter brothers were Union soldiers who came home to find the Klan terrorizing freedmen. They say you—" "That one night," she faltered, then continued more directly. "They say you burned out the Klan in a single night, that you made them vanish into the swamp." Thunder rumbled in the distance, an afternoon storm approaching from the west. Elias rose from his desk and walked to the window, watching as his brother looked up at the darkening sky. "Miss Green," he said finally, "history is full of things people won't write in textbooks. Some truths are carried in whispers." "Then it's true?" Her eyes widened. Elias turned back to her. "Stories keep the living safe. Truth keeps the dead awake." His weathered face held a gentle warning. "Which would serve your students better?" She considered this. "I believe children deserve truth, even when it's difficult." "Then teach them to read between the lines," he replied. "Show them how to question what's written and what's left out. That's the most valuable lesson." A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by another rumble of thunder. Outside, Elijah had started back toward the school, leaning slightly on a carved walking stick. "Will you at least tell me if you were really Union soldiers?" Naomi pressed. "The children say you fought at Shiloh and Vicksburg." Elias smiled faintly. "Yes, that much is true. The 55th Massachusetts. We enlisted under assumed names. Many black soldiers did. The Army records list us as the Brooks brothers. And after the war, when you came home, we found a different war waiting," he said simply. "One fought in shadows rather than on battlefield." The office door opened and Elijah entered, bringing the smell of earth and approaching rain. At 61, his once powerful frame had grown leaner, his hair completely silver. The scarred left eye remained permanently closed, but the right eye still held a soldier's watchfulness. He nodded politely to Naomi. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice rough with age. "Children should head home soon." Naomi stood respectfully. "Mr. Elijah, we were just discussing the school's history. Were you now?" He hung his hat on a peg by the door. "And what parts interest you most, Miss Green?" She hesitated, then answered honestly, "The parts that explain how two men built all this from ashes, how you defended it when others tried to destroy it." Elijah studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving, a child holding an open book. The craftsmanship was remarkable, each detail precisely rendered, despite being created by hands that now showed signs of arthritis. "I used to carve soldiers," he said, placing the figurine on the desk, "for every man who threatened us. Now I carve these instead." He gestured toward a shelf where dozens of similar figurines stood in neat rows, children reading, writing, standing tall. "They're beautiful," Naomi said softly. "You teach them to read," Elijah replied, "and they'll never be slaves again. That's the real victory." The school bell rang, warning of the approaching storm. Children gathered their belongings, lining up to depart as rain began to patter against the windows. Their voices rose in song as they filed out. "John Brown's Body," the same hymn once sung in Union camps. The melody carried through the halls, hauntingly familiar to the Carter brothers. Naomi excused herself to oversee the students' departure, leaving the brothers alone in the office. Elias watched his brother settle heavily into a chair. "She asks many questions," Elijah observed. "She's a good teacher because of it," Elias replied. "She reminds me of Father." Lightning flashed, illuminating the swamp in the distance, once a place of death, now green with new life. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof. Elias moved to close the window, pausing to look out over the land their father had once worked, land they had reclaimed and transformed. He spoke softly, as if to himself. The Klan came for 2 black men that year, but what they found were the ghosts of their own sins, marching back from the war they thought they'd won. Rain tapped against the window, steady and cleansing. In his chair, Elijah closed his good eye, smiling faintly as the children's voices faded into the storm. The war, at last, was over. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.